Another area that you really want to consider when you start talking about how I'm going to build my USD environment is what to do when people actually start clicking on stuff. So I'm going to start opening up a Dynamics 365 entity, or I'm going to click on a link inside the application that's going to open up another contact record or an account record. What's going to happen with that? How are things going to populate inside the application? You have a lot of different options. You can have it populate inline as part of just open up just like it would inside Dynamics 365. You could have it create a brand new session for that record. So for example, I'm working on an account, I open up a contact. Now inside that contact, maybe that contact has a different account record or something like that associated with it. I click on a brand new account. I'd probably want to open up a new session for that account record and have a variety of different tabs opened up inside there. At the same scenario, let's say I'm opening up an account and now I click on a contact. I don't necessarily want that contact to just display right on top of that account record. Maybe I want to open up a new tab. Well, that's where this whole concept of navigation rules come into play, where you're really going in and defining what type of behavior is going to happen when people interact with these links inside the application within the context of USD. So in this module, we want to really just provide you with an overview of what are window navigation rules. How do they work inside Unified Service Desk? We want to talk a little bit about the creation process, and more specifically the fundamental elements that you can create inside those rules that really are going to dictate what's going to happen when it starts interacting with the application. How is it going to display? Where is it going to display? What's going to populate inside that particular item? We're going to talk a little bit about rule orders and orders of execution. So understanding that you have a variety of different rules inside the context of USD, and it's going to evaluate those rules to determine what specific rule is appropriate in this situation. And then based upon what rule is appropriate, that's the one that's going to get applied. And so we're going to talk a little bit about how understanding the order in which those items get evaluated will really help allow you to achieve kind of your best results. And then we're going to talk about some different best practices around creating default rules at a hosted control level, creating default rules at an organizational level, and things that you can do just to make sure that you're giving yourself the best opportunity for success when you start creating these navigation rules inside the application. So what is a navigation rule? If you think about what we kind of talked about at the top of the module, basically what you're doing is you're determining if you want to or how you want to override the baseline default application behavior of Dynamics 365. Instead of navigating inline inside that application and having all the links and the items that you click on pop up in the same window, it now gives you the capabilities to launch that information in a brand new tab. So in some cases, you have the capabilities to really start defining additional scenarios, but basically it allows you to determine how you want that link that's been clicked on to populate inside the application. Now there's a lot of different options. You could continue to have it display inline as part of the application. You could have it go out and create a brand new session, and then inside that session initiate a new tab and then display that tab. You could have it just display a new tab inside the application, or maybe create a pop-up window. What's nice about these is these elements now allow you to really go in and dictate here's what's going to happen when somebody clicks on that. Now what's neat about these is it uses what's called kind of an order of evaluation. And so it looks at all the different navigation rules that you have inside your implementation, and it determines based upon the order that it follows which one matches. And once it finds a matching rule, then it goes out and that's the one that gets applied. And we'll show you that when we get into the application a little bit more. But if you've ever used like URL addressable forms, that's basically what we're doing here. Is we're dictating, okay, this is the item that we want to open up. This is where we want it to be displayed inside the application. So just like with URL addressable forms, I would have the capabilities if I wanted to display the ribbon or not display the ribbon or the command bar. I can hide that information as necessary, the navigation bars. All of that elements can be kind of suppressed to really give me that seamless interface. Now the other area where navigation rules come into play is for those of you who are going to move forward and start doing like some CTI integration and integration with your phone calls. This also handles that screen pop logic. So if you want to pop up screens in the application, it allows you to kind of dictate that. Now let's show you what I mean by kind of how this works. So think about inside USD. I'm inside, the search control, and I'm going to click on an account. The navigation rule is really going to dictate what happens when I click on that account. So the starting point is I want to click on an account. The outcome that I want to receive is when I click on that, I want it to open up a brand new session. Inside that session, I want it to open up a new tab, and then I want to display this record inside that new tab, and that's the tab that I want to bring to the forefront. And that's what a navigation rule does, is it says, okay, when this item is clicked on from this particular option, here's what I want to do. So one of the things that you're actually going to do is you're going to dictate kind of the starting source. So you're going to say when an action is initiated from this hosted control, and that action is directing me to go into another area or another entity, here's how I want to handle that process. And I'll show you that a little bit when we start building these individual rules inside the application itself. So here we can see kind of a real good example of a bunch of the active window navigation rules that you would see if you install the sample data. And so I want to draw your attention to a couple of different things on here. The first thing is you'll see that each one of these has an order number associated with it. Now some of them have the same order number, and that's okay, because we'll initiate or dictate why that is here in just a couple of seconds. But one of the things that you'll see is this order number defines the order in which these rules are evaluated. So it looks at it from kind of the lowest number, and then it evaluates it from the highest number. Now, what does it use from a criteria to evaluate that? Well, there's two key critical aspects here in regards to this. There's the from and there's the entity. So the from is basically saying where is this, what hosted control or what item inside the application is initiating this functionality. And the entity is basically saying where am I going based upon that situation. So the first thing that you'll see here, like in this search incident, is it's initiated from the search control. So 101 is the first item number associated with the search control. 102 is the second item associated with the search control, and then so on and so forth. So what it's going to do is it's going to look at what it is that you're trying to accomplish. So if I'm on the search control and I open up a case, then it's going to go down the order of execution, and it's going to say, okay, I'm starting from the search control, I'm opening up a case. The first time it finds a match in that situation, that's the navigation rule that's going to be used. And then inside that navigation rule, it will then populate what it should be doing. Should it populate it in a new tab or in another item? So if I might have 5 or 6 different items coming from a search control, each one of those might be going to a different type of entity. I might have one going to an account, I might have one going to a contact. And so what it does is it looks at that search order and it says, okay, 101 is coming from the search incident, it's going to the incident entity, that's not going to take place in this scenario, then it moves on to the next one and it finds the next order in that evaluation that is coming from the search entity, and if this time it's going to account and that's where I want to go, then that's the one that's going to be used. And then once it finds a match, it just kind of stops utilizing them. So the key critical aspects here that you want to remember when you design these rules is the order in which you want them to execute, the item or the hosted control in where it's coming from, and then the target or the entity that I want to send it to. And this gives you the capabilities now to kind of start working through that and seeing how that information is going to work through. So before we talk about logistics, let's take you in and look at these inside the application a little bit. So I'm going to go into Unified Service Desk, and I'm going to go into my window navigation rules. And I'm going to open up just one of the navigation rules so you can kind of see some of the logistics behind this. So this is that screenshot that we just kind of saw. And let's look at that first one. Let's go ahead and open up this search incident option and look at what that's going to look like inside here. So I'm going to go ahead and double click on this. So there's a couple of key elements that really drive how this navigation rule is going to work. Now obviously when you're creating them, the first thing that you need to know is what do you want to call this? So this is obviously just a descriptive name that you're going to use. The order is going to define that order of evaluation. So here's the first two options that are important. The route logic, the from, and the entity. So this is saying what item or what element inside Unified Service Desk is going to initiate this particular connection. So this is either coming from a specific hosted control or another element. So these are all the different hosted control options that I can choose inside my area. So I pick the hosted control that's going to initiate this functionality. The entity is, where is this going to go? What is the ultimate end result in where I want to end up? I want to end up on the case entity. I want to end up on the contact entity. That we all saw in kind of the initial setup of that scenario. Then you get into some of your initial situations in regards to what type of option is this? So based upon what they do, what do we want them to work with? And there's several different options here. There's pop-ups, there's onloads, there's in places. These are the type of route that it's going to be. Is it going to create a new pop-up? Am I working off of a pop-up? Is somebody going in and selecting an item from a menu? Is this an inline route? What's actually happening from the type of routing that this is going to be when somebody clicks on it? So before we do this, let's go back in the application now that we've seen kind of this initial scenario, and let's talk about some of these kind of key vantage points. So the first thing that you see when we were in there was that entity, and that entity defined what specific CRM entity we are going to initiate to or go to from that standpoint. And that basically uses kind of the entity item or the entity list. There's also a URL scenario. So you don't necessarily have to route it to an entity. You could route it to a specific URL. So one of the options that you can do is you could choose kind of the URL. From there, you've got the route type. And so the route type really dictates what type or how to handle that. So if it's a pop-up window, we define how we want to handle any pop-up windows that are working on it. The onload, this is really applied to any lookup field on the form after it's loaded. So once it's loaded into that situation, all your lookup fields are basically located and then executed against that situation. That way, if you wanted to load maybe like related records that are associated with that particular item within the lookup field, you could do that from that scenario. The other one that you see is like an in place. So a lot of what you see inside Dynamics 365 is people going in and clicking on a link and then just reloading that information in place. That's most of the behavior that you're seeing. So what this is saying is if this is an in place modification where something is going to be loading in place, how do I want to handle that? And then the other option that you have would be the menu chosen. So somebody selects something from a menu, now we're going to navigate part to the application. What do I want to do? So this is kind of defining how that item or that entity is going to be referenced and then where that might have been initiated. Is it coming from a pop-up, an in-place route, or what is the type of situation? The next thing that you have to look at is how do you want to display it? So there's what's called an action field. And so the first option that you have is if it's a route type or a pop-up option, you could choose to have it create a new session. So much like you saw when we were initially showing you some of the search functionality, when I click on a search option or I click on a specific record, it is using a pop-up. And so what's happening within that pop-up is it's saying, okay, now I want to create a brand new session within that application. And it now opens that up and allows me to move to it from there. Another option that you have is to route window. So what this will do is basically take that option, keep it in the same session. So instead of opening up a brand new session, it'll just create another tab within that same window or within that same session. And so now it's going to basically go ahead and work with it from there. You also could show it outside of this particular option if you wanted to. So if you wanted to have a kind of a control outside of the agent desktop, you could do that. You also could route it in place. So I don't want to go to a different tab. I just want to use the default functionality and I just want to pop over whatever it is that I'm working with. This is one of those areas where you really have to kind of ask yourself, what's going to make my end user's life easier? Is it going to be easier if stuff is initiated in a new session in this situation? Is it going to be easier if it just kind of browses inline? And a lot of times it's about finding the right combination of those individual situations. The other thing that you have to kind of determine is the destination. So the destination is important from a scenario as to where you want to put it. So for example, if it's a if it's a tab or a hosted control, I need to know where's that hosted control being displayed. So if I want to populate it into a hosted control called the count that I've created, I have to specify the hosted control that I want to populate it into within the context of that session. Maybe it's an entity search, and we haven't talked a lot about entity searches, but maybe I want to use that information to populate specific items inside an entity search to allow me to basically go ahead and dictate a little bit more information in regards to how that information is going to be populated moving forward. We'll talk a little bit about more entity searches later on as we move through. The other thing is once you've kind of defined, okay, this is where it is, the final scenario is where do you want to display it? So the target tab is the hosted control that will receive it. The show tab is the item that will receive focus. So if you think about how we've done things in the past, when we click on a specific item, it's going to open it up inside the application, and then it always kind of leaves it on that particular tab so I can now start interacting with it. So these navigation rules have several different kind of moving pieces or elements that dictate that. So let's pop back into the application here and look at that a little bit more. So now we can see in this scenario that this route type is a pop-up window. So this is going to create a pop-up. This pop-up is going to generate a new session. Now in this situation, it is going to send it to an entity search. So we have an entity search here called incident preload, which preloads some specific information about the incident and then populates it into the application. I could very easily, if I wanted to, set this to a tab, and then I could go in and create a new session, and then I could specify what specific tabs inside the application. So if I created a hosted control like we did earlier for bank account, and I'm going to open up a bank account record, I could now send out this basic search that says, okay, go to this bank account entity. Within this bank account entity, route that as a pop-up, create a new session, send this to a tab, and send it to the bank account hosted control that I've created, and then show the bank account hosted control, so that's now being displayed inside the application. This is what's going to really give you that formidable item around how that option is going to work. Before we create a navigation rule, let's show you this within the context of the application here. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to click on search again, and I'm just going to do a search for AdventureWorks. And I'm going to open up AdventureWorks. Now, once this opens, I'm going to just collapse the knowledge base search for a second. If I scroll down, I can see that I have an opportunity here. When I click on this opportunity, it is going to open up the opportunity, and it's going to open it up inline. So it's going to open it up right within the context of this same hosted control option that we're working with, which may or may not be what I want to do. In some cases, maybe I want to open this up in a brand new tab so I can see that information in here, so I could very easily switch back and forth if need be. It depends on kind of the environment that you're working in those situations. Let's assume, first for purposes of demonstration, that I would want this to open up in a different tab. So to do that, I'm going to go ahead and configure the application. So I'm going to go into my application. Now the first thing is I want to create an opportunity, and I want it to open up in kind of a new tab. So this is where I would have to designate kind of a targeted hosted control that I would want to work with. Now I could use any number of hosted controls. For our purposes, I'm just going to create a hosted control, and I'm going to call it opportunity, and I'm going to use it strictly for the purpose of opening things up inside there so I can kind of keep things constituted. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to click on new to create a new hosted control. I'm going to just call this opportunity. Now I'm going to leave everything else the same. It's not going to be global. It's going to work within the context of a session. It's going to be a CRM page. So I'm going to go ahead and just kind of leave this hosted control the way it is. So I'll go ahead and hit save. So now that I have kind of a container that I can use to store this information, now I'm going to create the actual navigation rule that I'm going to use to populate this information inside the application. So now I'm going to go into Window Navigation Rules, and I'm going to define options. Now remember when we talked about, kind of keeping things separate in the order of different situations, it's up to you to kind of decide what you want to do within the context of what it is that you're trying to work with. Now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to create a new rule. And I'm just going to call this Open Opportunity. And I'm going to give this a number of 200 because I want this to work within the context of the entire entity situation. So I've got a couple of different options here. So from the from standpoint, if I wanted this to only apply in situations where I was working with the account hosted control, I could come into here and I could choose account, and this would then constitute only working on this particular rule if it was initiated from the account hosted control, if I was going in directly to an opportunity. If I didn't want this to be within the context of that, if I wanted this to apply to any hosted control within the application, I could basically just leave this blank, remove this value, and now just focus on the entity itself. And so this is where I'm going to directly associate this with the opportunity. So I'm going to click on my lookup window, and I can see that I do have an entity type in here for opportunity. If I didn't, and I wanted to create an entity type for the item that I wanted to work with, this is where I could click on New, and all I would do is specify the schema name for the entity I wanted to work with. So in this case, like we know that account, contact, opportunity, they all come out of the box with those specific names. If this was a custom entity, I would then have to basically reference the custom entity name that I created. But in this case, I'm going to just go ahead and use opportunity, so I don't have to create a new entity or a new entity type since it already exists. So I'm going to choose opportunity. Now, the thing that I want to kind of keep in mind is what is constituting this behavior. So inside the application, if I were going to click on this opportunity, this would do normally inside Dynamics 365 an inline or an in-place browse. And so I need to tell that this is the type of route option that I'm working with. This is an in-place route that is going to work normally from the application. Now I could specify a different situation. Now where do I want it to go? Well, where I want it to go is I want it to route to a specific window. So the destination is that I'm going to create a new tab and I'm going to route the information to that tab. Now I need to specify where I want to route it to. Well, where I want to route it to is the opportunity entity, or the opportunity hosted control. So from a target perspective, I'm going to go ahead and choose the opportunity hosted control is where I want to route it to, and then after it's done, I want to focus the information on that. So I'm also going to do a show tab on the opportunity entity as well. And this is now going to do basically when somebody clicks on an opportunity from anywhere inside the application, it's going to route it to a new tab and populate it within the context of that item. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to save this. Now again, because it's a configuration change, I am going to close out of Unified Service Desk. I'm going to reopen it. Give it just a sec to load, and then we're going to walk through that exact same situation that we did at the beginning of this particular demo. We're going to go in, we're going to navigate to AdventureWorks, we're going to click on the opportunity, but you're going to notice that the behavior is going to be different. In this case now, when it opens up, it's actually going to open up in a new tab. Now, because we created as a default, I could go to anywhere where I'm going to specify and open up an opportunity, and it would then go in and do this exact same functionality. So we'll give it just a sec here to finish loading up the context of the application. It's maximized it. Now I'm going to go into search for AdventureWorks. Collapse this for just a sec. Now I'll come down into my recent opportunities. I'll click on this option, and you'll notice that it has done exactly what we asked it to do. It went in, it created an opportunity. It opened up the opportunity in a new window, and now it's got some different navigation elements that it's kind of constituted within whatever it is that we're doing. So this is a real good example of where you could use navigation rules. Now, if I wanted to, I could take this down even further, and I could limit this and say, okay, I only want this situation to take place when I'm working from the account hosted control, which is initiating that context from here. And I could even go in and say things like I want to specify that the navigation element and the command bar have been collapsed to really give it more of a customized look and feel. So now in this case, I'm going to just close out of Unified Service Desk because I don't want to have that open anymore. I'm going to go ahead and go back into my navigation rule, and I'm going to change this just a little bit. I'm going to switch the hide command bar to yes and hide navigation bar to yes. And then I'm going to do one more situation here where I'm going to change this rule number to, let's say, 110. And now I'm going to say if this takes place from the account hosted control. And now I'm going to save my changes. Open up Unified Service Desk again. So we'll do the same thing. I'll go to Search. Going to open up AdventureWorks. Now I'm going to come down here. I'm going to click on my option. And you'll see it does the same thing. It opens it up. But now I don't have the navigation bar. And the other thing that I don't have now is I don't have the command bar. So it just opens it up into a different area. So this is how you can really kind of control behavioral type situations in regards to what's taking place. Now the other option that I could do here if I wanted to, I could do a search again for AdventureWorks. This time I'm going to open up the contact, Nancy. And now from a Nancy perspective, I could go in and I could click on AdventureWorks Cycles. You'll notice that it opens up AdventureWorks Cycles directly within this same hosted control. And now if I click on this option here, you'll notice it doesn't open a new tab. What it does here now is it actually just opens up that opportunity inside the same thing. And the reason why is because when we initiated this through the search, by opening up Nancy, we actually launched the contact hosted control and not the account hosted control. And the rule that we created when we went in and modified it the second time said only do the pop-up functionality when we're initiating it from the account hosted control. So again, it really gives you that look and feel where you can decide based upon the context and how this information is going to populate, how you want the interface to be manipulated accordingly for your individual users. So this is really just the tip of the iceberg. If you think about kind of the advanced configuration options that you can do with these navigation rules, they open up just a variety of different options. And so what I would really encourage, and you'll see that as you play through, is play with the different route types and see what's going to happen and how that's ultimately going to control where things display. It gives you two totally different user interface experiences based upon where they're originating that information from within the application. So one of the things that we kind of, I challenge you to do is to look at different implementation scenarios. So, what we've been talking about to this point have been very specific situations. So we have a rule that is going to apply in very specific scenarios. Like for example, this one. This particular rule is only going to apply on an account pop-up that originates from this search hosted control. So I can see in here that if it's coming from the search control and it's going to the account entity, then it is going to go ahead and initiate this rule where it's going to do a pop-up, it's going to create a new session, it's then going to send it to the account hosted control, and then it's going to show the account hosted control. That's a very specific situation. Now, the problem that you sometimes run into is you may not always know those specific situations. I may want to go and route it to an account hosted control, but I may not know where it's coming from. It may not be coming from the search item, it might be coming from another area. So one of the things that you have the ability to do with these navigation rules is you can create kind of more default rules at an entity level. So by doing that, all you're really doing is you'll notice that I got rid of the from option here. So instead of having it come from something, I am just saying if the target environment is the account entity, here's what I want you to do. I want you to do a pop-up and I want you to route it to the account tab or the account hosted control, and then I want to show the account hosted control. Which is nice because maybe 50 or 90% of the time, this is the behavior that you want. But in those rare instances where it's coming from the search control, now I create a search control rule that has a higher number than the default rule. And so you see that kind of inside the application. This is where we can now start building that functionality. Now, the other option that you have is you could just do kind of a global default rule. And you could say, okay, if all else fails, if I don't know what the situation is and I don't have any other kind of rules defined for this particular element, this is what I want you to do. I want you to basically make it a pop-up window, and I want you to show it outside of the application. Now, let's show you this now that we've talked about this. Let's show you this inside the app here a little bit. So here's some real good examples. So I can see if I go into my 200s, these are entity-specific rules. So these are default rules at an entity level. I've got one specifically for the account entity, for email, incident, contact, task, phone call, and lead. So basically what it's saying is no matter where it's coming from, if somebody tries to navigate to the account entity, it's going to create a pop-up window. It's going to route it to the account hosted control, and that's what's going to have focus inside the application. However, in certain situations, and then same thing for incident. In an incident situation, it is going to go ahead and route it to the incident hosted control and show that option. However, if it's coming from the search option, then it's going to go ahead and it's going to do this a little bit different. It's going to route it to an entity search and display the information in from there. So this is where I can start to now build that functionality. So if you have those kind of anomalies, those rare situations where things are going to work, build those specific rules first, have those rules with a higher order, and then if those rules have a higher order, it'll look to see if those match first. If they don't, then it'll skip it, go right into your default scenario. And then finally at the very bottom, I've got this 10,001. This is that if all else fails, if there's no other situation that's defining what's going to happen within these scenarios, then I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to display it outside of the context of the application because it doesn't necessarily apply. So as you can see, this is really an art form. This is one of those things where you don't necessarily, kind of get this first try. You really do some trial and error situations. Every organization is different. There's a lot of different ways that you can determine how you want to handle the navigation rules within the application. I've seen a lot of situations where there's a lot of specific rules within that scenario. I've seen a lot of situations where they don't have a lot of specialized circumstances, so they have a lot of default rules within that situation. Generally, from my perspective, what I try to do is I try to have the fewest number of rules that I can to give me the desired behavior. I try to use default rules as much as I can unless I have those anomalies. And so then in that situation, then I'll go in and I'll kind of create those specific rules. So for me, I'll look at it at kind of an entity-based scenario and say, okay, here's what I need to happen for each one of these entities by default. And then I go back in and say, okay, but are there any specialized circumstances? There are. Yep, if I'm trying to open a contact directly from an account, I really need that to do this, which is different than what I defined. Then I'll go out and I'll create that rule with a higher order number, so that gets evaluated first, and in those situations where that applies, then it will apply that. The big thing to remember is once it finds a matching rule, it doesn't look for any other one. So it's not going to go out and determine if there's a one that matches better. It's going to say, this is the one that I found, this is the one I'm going to use, and we're going to move forward. So this is really one of, like I said, an art form. Play with it a little bit, understand what's going to work best for you in your situation, organize the rules, and then you'll start to see how the behavior is going to quantify that moving. Just because of the nature of USD and the fact that you're not just working with Dynamics 365 information all the time. A lot of times you're working with third-party information, other applications. Just because of the nature of it, the experience is going to be different for your users. And that's something that is very critical to understand in the context of what it is that you're trying to do. And because you don't necessarily want things to always open up right on top of each other, or likewise, you don't want to run into a situation where you have 27 different tabs open up in a singular session. So that's where you really have to start understanding what you want that user experience to look like inside the application. And that's where these navigation rules come into play. By creating these navigation rules, you now have the ability to really dive in and control how each specific screen inside the USD interface is going to load into the application. Is it going to populate in from one from a larger scale, or is it going to populate in from a specific tab? Is it going to display in a brand new session? How is it going to be displayed to the user within that situation? Now remember that you're going to have a lot of different items associated with a singular entity. You could initiate contact with the account entity 15 different ways inside the USD interface, and each one of those 15 ways might end up with a different result. One time it might populate into a new tab, one time it might just browse inline, one time it might open a new session. You need to kind of really constitute those situations in regards to where they are going to work with, and then build your rules accordingly. And remember, rules that need to be evaluated first, or more specific situation type rules, have to have a smaller number. Once it evaluates that smaller number rule and defines that it's going to work, then it's going to apply that one. So because of that, what I do recommend is, look at the entities or the items as a whole and create default rules and say, okay, unless I specify otherwise, anytime somebody tries to access the account entity, I want it to navigate to the account hosted control in a new window, in a new tab, and this is what I want to display. But in those rare situations where I want to work on it on a different scenario, I just create that very specific rule, define a lower number, and then that gets used in those rare situations. But default rules at an entity and a global level can really minimize and make it easier for you to get the desired functionality, but not have to have 700 rules to be able to achieve that functionality in the application.